Joanna Lannister is yet another character within the world of Ice and Fire who doesn't really exist as an individual, developed personality on her own, but who rather serves as a foundational building block for the trajectory of House Lannister and all of the major Lannister characters throughout the mainline story. She is an interesting component of the narrative for a few reasons, though. In a sense, she seems to be a foil to similar characters who are deceased but have a massive impact on the family that they left behind, in the vein of other women dead before their time like Lyanna Stark or Elia Martell. But she is compelling and arguably more unique, in the sense that the Lannisters that remained and were traumatized by her death are incredibly villainous characters who still idolize Joanna not necessarily as an individual, but rather a symbol of the family that the Lannisters believed they could have had. A representation of what kind of people each individual Lannister could have been had things just not gone wrong for them. And the moment of her death is pretty distinctly recognized as the point where each of the Lannisters as well as their family unit was destroyed in some sense or another. And on this basis alone, it comes as no surprise that both the characters within the fictional universe as well as the readers outside of the story tend to idealize Joanna Lannister symbolically rather than considering what she may have truly been like personally. Clearly, George R.R. Martin has a particular appreciation for this character archetype. He loves introducing women who died unfairly before their time, whose loss clearly traumatized their remaining loved ones, and whose memory feels more like a fantasy woman rather than a real one. However, there are also always hints and undercurrents that seem to suggest that the actual people that these women were don't match up to the idealized image that many people have of them. Lyanna Stark is typically remembered as the great love of Robert Baratheon's life, despite the fact that she literally fled to escape him. Elia Martell is remembered as the woman who wasn't enough to live up to Lyanna Stark, and yet she was at least interesting and brilliant enough to have a greater impact on the worldly, intelligent Oberyn Martell than arguably anyone else he ever met. So clearly, there are indications that the way that these women are perceived in the contemporary time is extremely different and possibly diametrically opposed to the people that they really were. And then, there is Joanna Lannister. Joanna is a really interesting iteration of this character archetype, because we don't even really get a contemporaneous first-person account of who she was from an adult who knew her well. Obviously, Jaime and Cersei were old enough to remember their mother before she died, but they never got to know her as an adult in the way that they did with their father. And while Tyrion does seem to fantasize about his mother's kindness and potential love for him, he literally has no real memories of her whatsoever. There are contemporary accounts of Joanna Lannister's role at court, but rather than examining anything about her personally, her existence within history is seen through the lens of Aerys Targaryen's borderline obsession with her. And clearly, his interest in her was entirely superficial. Truly, the only person who knew her as an individual is someone who doesn't really speak about her at all in the present day. The people who knew Tywin and Joanna believe that he loved her deeply and that her loss essentially robbed him of whatever kindness he had left. But this isn't something that he really speaks about himself. In fact, he hardly refers to his deceased wife at all, and he doesn't ever discuss his feelings for her or who she was as a person. Ergo, everything that almost everyone knows about Joanna, both within the story and as readers of the story, is based on little more than wild guesses. Although fan perception of any character obviously varies, the general point of view about Joanna Lannister seems to be largely guided by the fantasies that the Lannister children have about her, as well as the fact that these kind of characters tend to fall within a particular stereotype. Specifically, many readers tend to imagine her as a kind woman who brought out the only goodness that existed in Tywin Lannister, and whose love and care could have completely changed the trajectory of a family who are some of the greatest villains in A Song of Ice and Fire. Again, this isn't a particularly surprising assumption, given that this is the implication of most of the very important dead women in the world of Ice and Fire. There seems to be a pretty consistent juxtaposition between dickish men like Aerys Targaryen, Rhaegar Targaryen, and Robert Baratheon, versus the unfairly treated women in their lives, Rhaella Targaryen, Elia Martell, and Lyanna Stark. But I think upon further consideration, it seems more likely that Tywin Lannister and Joanna Lannister are meant to be a foil to this traditional dynamic rather than another example of it. Clearly this is nothing more than speculation, But it is very interesting that Joanna is portrayed as the only person who Tywin ever seemed to truly love. And a lot of people make certain assumptions about her character based on that. But I think that those assumptions may be diametrically opposed to the reality of who her character was designed to be. The trope of a woman who is so good and so pure that she manages to change the cold heart of a complete shithead is everywhere in fiction. So the perspective that sees Joanna as the only good part of Tywin that died when she did makes sense. But it doesn't feel very true to life either. What actually makes Joanna a potentially interesting character is imagining just what kind of person Tywin Lannister would actually be hopelessly in love with. Because as we can see with him and his children, he doesn't really love them for the people that they are. And being nice to him or desiring his love has no positive impact on his perception of them. He is the most concerned with Jaime because Jaime fulfills Tywin's fantasy of a perfect heir in almost every way that matters to him. But he is clearly devastated when Jaime becomes disabled and that image is shattered. And his care for Jaime as an individual seems to be non-existent. Cersei comes in second in his mind, because she is once again a good physical representation of what Tywin likely sees as Lannister ideals. And because she offers him the chance to give the most important seat and power in the country to a Lannister. It's through her that the Lannisters have achieved Tywin's greatest goal, the Iron Throne. But he sees her more as a tool and shows no regard for her actual happiness. And he seems to have had barely any interest in raising her or developing a personal relationship with her. And of course, Tyrion is the bane of Tywin's existence. Because despite the fact that he does have valuable qualities, he's weak, unattractive, disabled, and offers Tywin nothing particularly good in terms of political power. He's repulsed by the very thought of Tyrion being a representation of House Lannister. And to add insult to injury, in Tywin's mind, Joanna died so that Tywin's biggest nightmare could live. So to put it succinctly, Tywin is not a caring person. He loathes even his own children for the weaknesses that he sees within them, and he values his family the most for how they can reflect well on him or how they can offer him more power. So the idea that he loved Joanna because she was sweet and kind and brought out his inner humanity seems extremely unlikely. In reality, it seems far more plausible that Tywin was in love with Joanna because she was extremely similar to the kind of person that he is. And she fulfilled his fantasies of his perfect wife in the ways that he may have fulfilled her fantasies as an ideal husband. For all of their faults, Lannisters are, on the whole, extremely pretty people. And even among them, Joanna Lannister was attractive to the point of being legendary, as even the king himself seemed to be bizarrely fixated on her and extremely perturbed that he couldn't have her for himself. Of course, the historical account of Joanna and Aerys's relationship implies that they may have had sexual contact, or he may have somehow assaulted her. But those allegations seem to be unlikely. Maester Pycelle isn't wrong that Tywin almost certainly would have refused to marry someone who wasn't a virgin. And if Aerys insulting Joanna's postpartum chest was enough to drive Tywin to attempt to resign his hand, then it seems very improbable that Aerys and Joanna had any intimacy whatsoever. Truly, the biggest indication that anything may have happened between them was Tywin's implication that Tyrion might not be his. But I think that was probably delusionally wishful thinking, or a resistance to believe that something Tywin hated so much could have come from him and Joanna. And given that Tyrion's similarities with Tywin seem to be stronger than Jaime's or Cersei's, the theories that Tyrion is actually a Targaryen are pretty hard to buy. But what is considerably easier to buy is the idea that perhaps Tywin loved Joanna so much because she embodied everything he believes a Lannister should be. Her beauty was renowned, but she was loyal to her husband. She seemed to manage Casterly Rock masterfully, just as a good lady should. And given that there are multiple reports that Tywin actually saw Joanna as something of a counselor and he trusted her knowledge and advice, it seems safe to assume that she was probably as intelligent or even more intelligent than Tywin himself. But aside from that, one of Tywin's personal ideals as well as his beliefs about what Lannisters should be obviously involves an almost unfathomable level of elitism as well as a capacity for cruelty that is almost unrivaled. Frankly, Tywin loves brutalizing anyone who crosses him, and he was seemingly repulsed by what he saw as his father's weakness when Tytos didn't immediately go scorched earth anytime someone looked at him sideways. Therefore, It's hard to believe that Tywin could ever be deeply in love with someone who wasn't as ruthless and arrogant as he was. Obviously, this is pure speculation, but it presents some interesting what-ifs about Joanna Lannister as a character. Tywin clearly despises the weak, so the likelihood that Joanna was just so sweet and so kind that she managed to win Tywin over seems very low. In fact, it seems much more plausible, and much more interesting, that Joanna was actually an exceptionally merciless and vengeful woman who knew how to hide her brutality beneath the veneer of ideal Westerosi womanhood. And that's why Tywin truly loved her when he seems to love literally no one else. And if we are to presume that the real Joanna was just as villainous, vain, and self-absorbed as all of her other family members, then the role that she plays in the narrative at large becomes even more intriguing. Tywin obviously misses her and has no desire to marry again once she's gone, which is somewhat unusual for a man of his status. And given the mythology surrounding their relationship, it's not hard to imagine that no one could really live up to her in his eyes. All of Joanna's children miss her as well, but again, they don't miss who she was as a person because they didn't know her. Rather, she serves as an avatar for whatever fantasy life that Jaime, Cersei, and Tyrion imagine but can never have. Essentially, they feel like if they had grown up with her love, everything would be different and immeasurably better for them. And this feels like it could be a really interesting play on George R.R. Martin's running theme of the memory of a dead woman not matching reality. There are plenty of female characters whose legacy doesn't seem to dovetail with their real selves. And it would be a fascinating irony if Joanna doesn't live up to the fantasy because she is just as mercurial and vicious as the rest of her family. Clearly, this speculation has almost no impact on reality, but it is interesting that so many people within the world of Westeros and readers who are experiencing the story from a bird's-eye point of view just presume that Joanna must have been the most decent Lannister, and that all hope for their family was lost when she was. That idea certainly doesn't jive with the kind of person that Tywin would genuinely connect to. And the possibility of Joanna Lannister as a villain, rather than the pinnacle of motherhood and wifedom, is a fun one. Ultimately, the Lannister children fantasize that their mother would have made them into better people and that her love would have changed them fundamentally. They mourn her loss, but they are mourning something that never actually existed for them, only an idea that they cling to in order to make themselves feel better. So, the possibility, if not probability, that Joanna would have been every bit as abusive and cruel to her children as Tywin was, casts House Lannister in an even more interesting light. And while so many people see Joanna as the Lannisters' chance to turn away from villainy, it seems far more likely that she would have made her family even more villainous. But what do you think? Are we meant to see Joanna Lannister as a victim, or is she a hidden villain? Leave your comments and opinions below, and if you're interested in more content like this, like and subscribe.